going to record because Kia ora and ni hao. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Lisa Ellis of Otago. Now my te reo early in the morning has gone completely out of my head. Otaku is also because it's Kaitahu
It is South
pronunciation
Island.
here. So yeah,
Yeah,
Otaku Waka, aka the University of Otago, who's giving today's talk, Kant's Mature Cosmopolitanism in the Anthropocene. I had the great pleasure to spend time with Lisa last year, so I can say that aside from being an exemplary scholar, she's also an exemplary teacher. I was most impressed by her idea of having a walking office hour where students who know the route can ambush Lisa as she walks through campus and ask her questions. I imagine if you have a fragile heart, this kind of walking office hour thing could be incredibly dangerous for one's health. Lisa's recent work has focused on environmental political philosophy, particularly on how just environmental policy decisions can serve to aid human flourishing for current and future generations. She also focuses, as we're seeing today, on the political philosophy of Immanuel Kant and social contract theory. I should also point out that Lisa is the Deputy Director of the PPE program at Otago. So, hello, Lisa, and welcome to our seminar series. We'll also be having a response after Lisa's talk by Dr. Yin Shofu, who's Assistant Professor of History at the University of British Columbia. So, welcome to you as well. Now, Lisa, do you have slides you want to be showing?
I do. Let me just share them.
This is the point I go. We probably should have actually made sure the sharing of slides worked before we started the seminar, but luckily it looks like it is going to work.
How's that looking?
That looks fantastic. So, if you'd like to begin your presentation begins now.
Kia ora. Thank you, thank you, Shofu. Thank you, people who are attending. I'm really grateful for this opportunity. As we were just talking about, it's a sort of sadly perfect moment to talk about how we can orient ourselves to ideals that we know bind us in a world so imperfect that it's impossible to act on them. So in this paper, I argue that we find ourselves in the Anthropocene era, and the best guide for how to avoid doing wrong all the time in the Anthropocene era comes from Kant's mature cosmopolitan political thought. I'll start by talking about what it means to be an Anthropocene human being, outline some preliminary reasons why we might be interested in Kant, and then move on to talk more in more detail about how we might get guidance from Kant's work. Oops. So the International Union of Geological Sciences declined in 2024 to declare the present time the Anthropocene era of geological time. They had technical reasons for that made a lot of sense, but they did name it an Anthropocene event. And if you look at the slide here, you can see that in the Holocene, which is our current official geographical era, we have enjoyed 12,000 years of unusually stable climate with relatively little fluctuation over the long run. And these 12,000 years were ones in which it was possible to do an awful lot of things as human beings. Then, very recently, in what we can call the Anthropocene event, we are moving out of Holocene stability onto something else, probably something that looks more like the past. So of the 9 basic planetary boundaries that Earth scientists use to describe the conditions of possible flourishing on this planet, everybody understands climate change best, and that's what I'll focus on today. And most people understand the basics of climate change, but what I think isn't understood very well, and what we need to understand to follow this talk, is the narrowness of the window that we have to preserve a basic amount of climate stability that would enable flourishing now and in the future. There are, of course, some promising trends, especially the rapid uptake of increasingly cheap renewable energy. But net emissions are still rising. And if you think about it as a global budget for allowable emissions under what is commonly recognized as a cap of 2 degrees above pre-industrial global mean surface temperature, in other words, if we are able to keep our global heating below that 2 degree cap, then the consequences we'll experience will be less than if we exceed it. So we know that climate-related technology has appeared, like we have this new cheap renewable energy technology, and we can expect that, at least for the foreseeable future, climate technology will continue to appear. But what we don't know, and what I think is often underestimated, not only by the general public, but especially by the scholarly community and the policy community, what we don't know is the actual effects of the new technology as it arrives. There's a great deal of uncertainty about the effects on the Earth system of different technologies as they arrive. So take the most recent past. You would have had to be quite a lucky guesser to realize that we would have simultaneously the advent of incredibly cheap and productive new renewable technology. But at the same time, and at almost the same quantity, we would have new technology, large language models, data centers, things like that, that would drive a steep jump in global energy demand, almost canceling out the jump in available electricity from renewables. Um, what I take from that is that we really have to accept that powerful new technology, even if we can count on it arriving, we cannot count on its consequences. It changes society in unpredictable ways. So it seems irrational to rely on the promise of new technology. We know new technology will be socially transformative, but we don't know about its timing and impacts. And it seems crazy to assume that new technology will solve our problems when, in fact, adjusting our energy regime within current technological limits is perfectly possible if we were willing to coordinate our behavior properly. Faith in this capacity of human beings to expect that technology will save us is, I think, really a world historical mistake. And the author who's written about that most movingly is the philosopher Tim Mulgan. So Tim Mulgan imagines a conversation in a philosophy seminar of the future where they've used time travel to bring in a representative from our age, which Mulgan calls the affluent age. And he calls the future the broken world. It's an age in which Holocene stability has entirely dissipated so that it's impossible to predict from one season to the next the conditions of possible, for example, agriculture or water production or weather, things like that. And Mulgan's fictional philosopher engages with the envoy from the affluent world who said, well, we always thought technology would solve this problem. And the broken world philosopher responds um, that, it might have been possible that technology would save us, but it never became actual. So Mulgan's future broken world philosopher knows that with behavior change, the affluent world could have made the broken world a non-possibility. Mulgan speculates that we just don't have the conceptual and imaginative resources in the affluent world to make that possible. Um, I think Mulgan identifies a really quite serious intergenerational wrong, that we have the capacity to prevent the advent of the broken world, and we're not using it. So Anthropocene human beings find themselves in circumstances where our systems are unable to achieve what we know we need to do. If you think of something as simple as reducing emissions through net zero targets, we all know how they're supposed to work, but we're faced with this interaction between, on the one hand, I think I've missed yeah, there we go. we're faced with this interaction between, on the one hand, emitters get all the benefits of adding additional units of greenhouse gases to the global climate sink, so that's private for them. And then the costs of those emissions are spread out over time and space, so they hit the most vulnerable today and in the future. It's very difficult to solve these well-known collective action problems, and there are traditional solutions for those collective action problems. Those are either submission to a common rule of law, the so-called Leviathan solution, or privatization of the resource so that people have incentives to maintain it sustainably. And of course, neither of these solutions to global collective action problems are available for us. We have neither a Leviathan mediating the relationships among all the emitters on Earth, nor is it possible to privatize the global sink. Anybody can add to it at any time. There's nobody stopping me from firing up my minivan and going for a drive, for example, or even opening a new factory. Um, so we have a world that we inhabit where we know what we need to do. The right thing to do is to transition from the fossil fuel energy regime to something renewable that doesn't externalize our costs onto the future and the most vulnerable in the present. But we also find ourselves unable to coordinate to make that happen. Whoops. Yeah. So the question for Kant and for us is the one at the top of this slide. How should we orient ourselves to an unreachable ideal? Being a member of a species capable of altering the geographical record, so I should say geological record, is very different from the old social contract conflict of which sovereign should I obey? And existing devices that we're used to using to mediate our relations were never meant to withstand the kind of concentrated antisocial interest that they're facing today. The old system was meant to handle bad actors or irrationality or self-dealing or local tyranny, not world-breaking extraction in the service of short-term interests and against the interests of nearly everybody now and in the future. But the thing about social contract reasoning is it's still compelling as folk theory. We have this ideal that many people still buy that if we work hard and play by the rules, the system should deal fairly with us. So we have an ideal that is unreachable, but still compelling from a moral point of view. So having said this about the Anthropocene, now I want to say a little bit about your sort of classic Kantianism and why we can, if we take a wider view of what Kant offers, he's more useful for our Anthropocene world. So he's known for a social contract theory that features the imperative to submit to the rule of law administered by a state. And the pure statist reading emerges from two really basic, sort of intuitive ideas. For Kant, the only innate right is to freedom from determination by another's will. So somebody else shouldn't be able to arbitrarily make choices for me. But then there's a second condition that distinguishes Kant's theory from a sort of straightforward libertarianism. He says, look, we're dwellers on the surface of a watery globe, and we cannot avoid affecting one another. For example, if we claim some property as our own, we are expecting everybody else to respect that claim. So from these two ideas, it follows that it's really difficult to avoid wronging each other all the time, because every time we make an action that's other affecting, which is nearly all of our actions, then we are imposing what Kant would call unilateral determinations on everybody else. We're expecting everybody else to conform to things that they have had no say in. What does Kant offer as a solution? Famously, he says we need to submit to what he calls omnilateral determination. That is the rule of law. So if you think about it with regard to something like property, you could say, well, how is it possible for me to have anything as my own property when every time I claim something, I'm expecting without any sort of consultation, everybody else to respect it? And, with the old sort of more libertarian interpretations, they say, well, if you work it and you're productive, then it's yours and everybody else has to respect it. For Kant, things like developing, fencing, working, those are just signs. Those aren't actual ways to establish a right to something. Because again, you can't unilaterally impose your will on everybody else. Um, so one wonders, for someone like Kant, how is any property ever possible? And his answer is that it is possible to have property under the rule of law. It's possible to have property in the civil condition. Since I can't ask everybody else's permission, I have to enter into the rule of law where we have our relations mediated by a third party, which reflects our mutual self-determination. So for Kant, the only way to avoid arbitrary determination, the only way to have any property would be to enter a state. That's the standard statist reading. It's an absolute requirement for Kant. It's a wrong of sort of spectacular proportions if you engage with other people and then you fail to enter a state with them. And this statist reading of Kant's is certainly part of his overall political philosophy. It explains a lot of his weirdest positions. For example, Kant is known for being the great avatar of public speaking and freedom of the pen, and yet he never wavers on the following proposition. He says, it's not okay to investigate the origins of any existing state. And why would somebody who's big on free speech rights claim that it's always illegitimate to investigate the origins of a state? Well, you can make sense of that position if you think that for Kant, all possible non-wronging interaction as such has to happen under the auspices of a state. And he knows all existing states are rooted in violence and arbitrariness, but we have to at least pretend that it's ideal. So there are, of course, some problems with this theory. The statist account of social contract theory, it makes good sense when you think about how can I avoid wronging people who I always affect, but I cannot ask permission. On the other hand, if you limit possible right relations only to relations that are actually mediated by some sort of law, even imperfect law, but some sort of law, you're going to eliminate an awful lot of interaction from the sphere of right. You're going to relegate it. For Kant, you've got the sphere of right on the one hand and arbitrary violence on the other. And I don't think we want to relegate everything that is not, in fact, mediated by an existing state to the realm of violence. And Kant says we share the watery surface of the planet with each other. And so we can't escape possible interaction with everybody else there. We could say, look, either Kant thinks that the only right relations happen under the mediation of the rule of law, or there must be some way to do right and wrong outside the rule of law, even though there's no third party assurance set up in those circumstances. If Kant thought the former, that the only right was available under the mediation of a state, then not only would, for example, foreign visitors on a shore be outside the realm of right relation and you could do anything you want to them, which is not Kant's position. Not only would that be a problem, but in my view, it would eliminate all new relations as such, because if there's no existing law that mediates those relations, if you have some original kind of relation, for example, you invent a new technology that puts us in relation in a way that law hasn't anticipated, anything that isn't mediated by rule of law under that position would be outside the realm of right. And that would include all new relationships as well as all relationships that transcend state boundaries. That can't be Kant's position, and it explicitly isn't Kant's position. In the paper, I give a lot of examples of Kant applying the idea of right relation to relations that are not mediated by law. So if we accept the other horn of the dilemma and we say, well, there must be right relation outside the mediation of the rule of law, then you ask, well, how can we possibly know, since there is no neutral assurance legal authority that we can refer to, how can we possibly know whether we're doing right in these relations outside the rule of law? And Kant's answer is going to be that we have to orient ourselves not to an actual civil society, but to the idea of a civil society, that we can all orient ourselves to the idea of mediated right relation, even if we don't have access to it. So Kant, for example, offers us a test that we can use, especially if we're decision makers, but also if we're just thinking about common right relation. And that is his famous so-called Republican test. And by Republican, he doesn't mean Republican Democrat or anything like that. He means accountable to the people, something that would represent omnilateral rather than unilateral will. So his Republican test is, as I've said on the slide, the touchstone of whatever can be decided upon as law for a people is whether they could impose such a law on themselves. And the beauty of this test is that it works hypothetically. Um, you can have teeth to this rule, even if you can't, in fact, ask people. It is possible to imagine, for example, as Kant did, that no people could affirm advantages for a minority that didn't accrue to everybody. So Kant's example is we know that advantages for members of the hereditary nobility are wrong because nobody could rationally affirm them, but we might tolerate them provisionally if the existing hereditary rulers are moving us toward progress. Um, so I do think we should look at Kant as someone for whom the statist account is part of, but not all of, his theory of right relation. We've seen that refusing to enter into right relation is wrong in the highest degree, and that's only one of many examples of cases where outside civil relations you can still do wrong. It must be possible to do wrong outside the rule of law. The difference is that the wrong isn't framed by Kant as interpersonal injury because you don't have any agreed upon standard. Instead, it's wrong against something else. It's a wrong against human nature, sometimes he says, or it's wrong against the idea of the kingdom of ends, he says elsewhere. It's still wrong, but it's not like interpersonal injury. And if you think about it, it would be a really quite a large mistake to limit your theory of justice to interpersonal injury because there are so many actions that are other affecting that cause people to feel that their choices have been determined arbitrarily, and yet you can't you can't travel an individual chain back to one wrongdoer. There must be structural injustice, and Kant can account for that with this more capacious idea of wrong. In fact, whoops, Kant was well aware that ordinary people can't just wish the civil society into existence. And, for much of his work, he talked about what we should do when we find ourselves in imperfect circumstances. As early as What is Enlightenment in 1784, he talked about how you could manage when your state authorized superiors tell you to do something that your common reason tells you is not right. Um, it's a normal circumstance, not an unusual circumstance from Kant's point of view, for us to be obliged to obey a radically imperfect law. So how can we deal with that fact that we need to, as far as possible, operate under the existing mediation available to us through the imperfect rule of law, but also try to be true to this idea of right relation that all of us have access to through our reason. And he gives us some pretty cool examples. So in What is Enlightenment, he has this example, for example, of a clergyman who's asked to give us a sermon on a topic that the clergyman himself thinks is just wrong. It doesn't jibe with an enlightened view of religious thinking. And Kant says, well, he's working for the church. He has to mediate his relations with his flock the way the church has ordered, because this is the available mediation. And it's not for him to just unilaterally determine the kind of sermons that churchgoers get to hear. So he has to give the sermon and he can, hedge his bets and say, the church tells me to tell you X and such. But, and this is the crucial part, obedience to existing imperfect law does not exhaust the duties of the clergyman. The clergyman must, when he's delivered his sermon, also express to the public through writing essays or speaking what he thinks right religion amounts to. And so you can see again this conflict, this distinction between interpersonal injury on the one hand, and it would be an interpersonal injury if the clergyman just took it upon himself to say whatever he wanted, because he'd be violating rules that he's operating under in the church. But on the other hand, he needs to do right according to the ideal that he and everybody else have access to through their common reason. And therefore, as a private citizen, it's important for him to speak the truth. And Kant has another example that I think is also really illuminating in this regard. And that's not about an individual clergyman, but about a whole church together trying to constrain all future members of the church by setting down a permanent religious creed. And in this case, Kant, again, isn't talking about interpersonal injury, but what he says is a crime against human nature, trying to say for future people, oh, we have had one instance of freely determining the contents of our religious belief, and everybody after that must only be a patient rather than an agent. This kind of constraint intrinsically denies people their choice, and from their perspective, arbitrarily, because they've had no say in it. So it's about the worst thing a group can do, according to Kant. And it's another good example of a violation of right that happens completely outside the civil order. In fact, it's attempting to constrain people who are under non-reciprocal relation with them. They're not even born yet. You can't have a real-time relation with future generations. Instead, you have to hypothetically imagine whether they could affirm that act that you're proposing to do to them. And if you can't imagine that they could affirm it, you are obliged to treat them rightly and refrain from doing it. Yeah. So in sum, for this section of the paper, the statist theory is important, but it certainly does not exhaust right relation for Kant. Instead, we have Kantian cosmopolitanism. He clearly realized that we would need rights outside the state. That's why we have a section on cosmopolitan right. It governs actions amongst agents who do not share a civil condition. And the most common example of this in Kant is the idea of a foreigner arriving on foreign shores, who should be treated with respect and not harm and have the right to visit, but certainly doesn't have the right to, for example, set up private property or even force people to trade with him. Everybody's stuck on the surface of this watery planet. Everybody always interacts with everyone else now and in the future. And because of this, it's not okay for us in our determinations of what people could will to ignore anybody with whom we even potentially interact. It doesn't matter if those people don't share civil law with us. They share a community of fate. They share an unexitable common space. And this mere physical relation has moral implications for Kant. It's not right for us to ignore them, even if they're outside our state. So my favorite writer on this topic is Jakob Huber. He's written this marvelous little book on Kant's grounded cosmopolitanism, in which he sort of spins out the implications of this dual fact that I just talked about. And he says, yeah, you know, the duties you have to each other under a state are certainly important. And you can't deny that Kant thinks you have to obey even an imperfect state. But these duties depend on a more sort of basic duty that we have to absolutely everybody with whom we share a fate. So we're all sort of shared dwellers on the surface of the planet. And as Earth dwellers, we stand in relation to everybody else, reciprocally affecting them. And we need to use the Kantian test of legitimacy if we can't ask them to determine our behavior. I really like the way Huber puts this. He says, as the relevant audience is no longer artificially restricted, like by arbitrary territorial barriers. As the relevant audience is no longer artificially restricted, distant strangers appear on our radar. Their standpoint counts in a normatively momentous sense. An emerging global public sphere changes what it means to reason publicly in the first place. It binds us to take into account the claims of all those with whom we find ourselves in disjunctive community of common possession. By that, he means if I take something, you can't have it too, disjunctive. In a disjunctive community of common possession and treat them as equal justificatory authorities. So Huber doesn't do this, but I think if you think from the perspective of Mulligan's broken world philosopher, or really from the perspective of climate change as a physical fact analogous to the fact that we share the surface of a watery planet, um, Huber's point about not being able to ignore other people with whom we share the earth applies across time as well as space. We have the same possibility for arbitrary determination of other people's choices as we affect the existing world as members of the Anthropocene, right? We're always already affecting the actual geology of the world. This is something that we need to consider future people's interests because otherwise they're being arbitrarily determined by our choice. So I think we can think of emissions analogously to Kant on original acquisition of property. Um, so we know that there's only so much we can emit if we want to have relative climate stability. And every time we add to the global carbon sink, that's a unit occupied in the global carbon sink that nobody else can occupy. So it's disjunctive in Huber's sense. Um, and if you think about the contrast between a proto-libertarian like Locke and Kant's view, you can see just how different their view is on original acquisition, right? Somebody like Locke, as I already said, he says you work the land, you put up your fence, you own it, you've made it productive. Kant says, no, those are just signs. You really need everybody's permission, and if you can't get it, you at least need an argument that hypothetically they would agree with your property, with your claim to property, because after all, it doesn't mean anything unless they all agree to it. And how can you expect them to agree to it without having had a say in that determination? The same thing applies, I think, to Kant's view about what Kant's view would be about emission, that every additional unit of emission I make is a unit of emission that nobody else can make. And therefore, if I don't imagine other people's determination on that action, I've unilaterally determined the budget that they will now face. And in fact, I don't write about this in the paper, but in fact, the German Constitutional Court used very similar reasoning to render Germany's can-kicking climate plan unconstitutional on the basis that it said to future generations, this is your tiny budget of remaining emissions. So I think we can think of original acquisition as similar to Kant's idea of original acquisition of property. If I acquire it, nobody else can. And so when I acquire it arbitrarily, that is without thinking of other people's interests, I really do harm present day and future climate vulnerable persons. And this violates the Kantian Republican legitimacy test. It subjects people to the interests of just a few in continuing the fossil fuel energy regime while sacrificing the interests of the many in things like subsistence and climate stability. It wrongs present day and future climate vulnerable people by constraining them to my choice in so many different ways. Like if I can no longer use the units of emissions that say you required, maybe you acquired them, you're Taylor Swift and you acquired them to take your sixth jump of the day in your private jet. Now I can't use those units of emissions safely to do things like fertilize my field or run my fishing boat or build my home. By continuing to acquire units of a scarce resource through ongoing greenhouse gas emissions, I am discounting the interests of present day and future climate vulnerable people relative to my own interests. In another part of Kant, he calls that radical evil, but that's not part of this paper. So to conclude, I think Kant's mature cosmopolitanism can diagnose Anthropocene wrongs. And even more than diagnosis, I think it can guide us in how we ought to relate to each other and orient ourselves toward justice under radically imperfect conditions. We do not need to wait for global order or even for our own state to do better in emissions regulation to know that treating our fellow Earth dwellers as negligible is wrong. When we operationalize this truth, we try to use coercive law. But as we saw, coercive law for this problem is generally not available. That does not mean we've exhausted our duties to others. Instead, we ought to express ourselves in the public sphere, organize civil society to make progress toward justice, and multiply plural spaces of behavior mediation to give us at least more possibilities for progress, no matter how dark things look. And again, among the most powerful tools in the Kantian toolbox is this hypothetical test. If affected others now and in the future could not affirm a policy for themselves, neither should anyone else. Thank you.
Sorry, it took me a few seconds here to locate the unmute button, which is always the issue when you mute yourself. Think, oh, I need to speak. Oh, where is the button gone? Thank you, Lisa. That was a fantastic talk. I have a lot of thoughts about it. But before we have any thoughts from myself, we have a response from Shofu. So, Shofu, are you going to use slides or just speak directly to camera?
Yeah, I will speak directly. Is my
All
voice
right.
okay?
It is absolutely fine. You can begin now.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lisa. It's such a privilege to read the paper and to learn from you. And to recapitulate a little bit, it's such a compelling account. So you begin with a philosophical diagnosis of the present era, the Anthropocene, and then you offer such a novel and compelling reading of Kant's mature cosmopolitanism, and then you conclude by showing us how this engagement with Kant provides a new way of addressing the crisis of our present moment. I think my comments will be divided into roughly two parts. First, I would like to ruminate on or reflect on your insights, which to me offer such a new and holistic way of reading and understanding Kant. To me, it's so refreshing. And then I will raise a question, maybe about an aspect of your paper that is particularly about our responsibility when placed in time and when this duty obligation is future oriented. So first, my takeaways. I think there's a prevailing way of reading Kant. One is even reflected in various editions of his complete works. According to this view, prevailing view, there's a pre-critical period during which Kant was a natural scientist working on cosmology, geology, followed by the far more significant or influential critical period, as we call it, when he emerged as one of the leading philosophers of the time. The problem with this reading is that it imposes the disciplinary boundaries of 2026 or 21st century onto the intellectual culture of late 18th century and Königsberg. That is, Kant was thinking about these issues geological, cosmopolitan, cosmological, so in such a holistic way. To overcome this problem, it is not a matter of forcing connections across different phases of Kant's work. We actually see such kind of interpretive efforts, but rather of entering into the deeper problematique that animates his writings across different stages of Kant's career. And I think your work is exemplary and is so compelling that demonstrate how we can do that. A particularly important keyword I highlight from your work, from your paper, is actually mature, which is in your title. I think maturity is such a familiar concept to all readers of Kant, thanks to was ist Aufklärung, what is enlightenment, where immaturity is defined so clearly as the inability to use one's understanding without the guidance of another. Maturity, I think, after reading your paper, I think I'm gaining a kind of whole new layer of understanding of this concept of maturity, which carries several layers of meaning. The first layer of maturity I think you have demonstrated is about the idea that humanity having already entered a mature stage. Now humanity possesses the capacity to make substantial and irreversible change to our planet, changing the geological record. This is a level of maturity. In other words, through the exercise of certain form of rationality that is more instrumental and technological, human beings have already achieved this kind of breakthrough. that enables them to make such changes. So in a serious sense, I think Kant has already anticipated this already in the mid and the late 18th century. And building on this, I think you have offered a very powerful and philosophical redefinition of Anthropocene. This is a philosophical and ecological concept building upon a deep engagement with the Enlightenment legacies upon which we are still kind of struggling with different issues. And this definition of Anthropocene goes far beyond than the synod of geologists today, right? And this goes to the next layer about maturity. So if human reasons has already reached this kind of maturity of transforming the earth, our planet, then there is an even more important dimension of maturity that concerns that it's no longer about technology, it's no longer about efficacy, it's no longer about efficiency, it's a deeper form of reason or rationality that is the capacity to legislate for oneself, that is, to how to realize freedom in this situation. Accordingly, so the question is, as you have nicely demonstrated, how to achieve freedom from others in such a world of being with others and in all kinds of these constraints. One possibility or one way of reading Kant is that humanity does so by self-imposing unilateral determinations upon itself. And this ends up with the omnilateral determination, which lies in the civil condition, that is, the rule of law, as you have shown. This is a pure statist reading, you call it. So what is wrong or limiting with this pure statist reading then? Well, there are different limitations, they are textual, but among others, I think a crucial one you have pointed out is that if this kind of approach, it effectively reproduces Kant's own definition of immaturity, right? It's precisely because maturity lies in the realization that for agents who share no civil conditions, they share cosmopolitan right so long as they dare to know and dare to exercise the capacity of rationality. So this exercise of rationality is mature for a deeper reason. That is to say, this is kind of, in this process, we start to not only engage fellow others of this time, but we start to take responsibility of future generations. And at this point, we start to be mature in a new sense. We start to recognize that freedom is seriously freedom in time. For instance, if at present I have two possible choices, let's say A and B, but someone due to some past action has made B no longer plausible for me, then that past action has in fact confined my present freedom. So by the same logic, if our action today restricts the range of possibilities available to future generations on this planet, then we are also depriving them of their freedom. I think this is my way of coming back to the title of today's talk, that is Kant's mature cosmopolitanism in Anthropocene. I think this title itself carries a profound sense of insight and wisdom. That is, the Anthropocene itself already signals a certain kind of maturity of mankind. And those living in this age must exercise that maturity by reflectively kind of taking on the responsibility for the future in a genuinely mature way. And this is Kant's mature philosophy. Then, having digested a little bit, I want to pose a question for you. It's a brief one. Basically, it concerns, if our responsibility to one another is situated in time and oriented towards the future, I wonder how this responsibility differ across different entities, such as individuals, groups, state. I think specifically, I'm quoting you, Kant's mature cosmopolitan social contract theory promised to clarify our obligations to one another while offering orientation for individuals and groups. It is precisely this end I would like to press on a little bit. Because Kant's example already concerns individual clergy versus the whole church. And the whole church is categorically different from being the kind of a simple kind of aggregation of different individuals. So I wonder how this kind of cosmopolitan right applies to individuals and a state differently. and how their obligations toward the future differently, and how about large transnational corporations, sorry. I'm thinking about how the Republican legitimacy test will be for entities like transnational corporations or state, because their rationale, play devil's advocate, is precisely premised upon a kind of commitment toward the future. Their logic is precisely if we do not develop in this way, if we do not pursue efficiency in this way, we are going to perish. We limit the freedom of our future generations if our entity do not thrive. So I'm very curious how your account of mature cosmopolitanism will offer a kind of constraint or normative guide to entities that is kind of somewhat different from individuals. So these are, yeah, some thoughts as I have been learning from this tremendously thoughtful and rich paper. Thank you.
Thank you. Lisa, do you have responses?
Well, my first response, Shofu, is just overwhelming gratitude. Thank you for that reading. I'm honored and unworthy. Uh, I'm going to have to think a lot about the use of the term mature because I think I was doing this unconsciously. I mean, mature was the word that occurred to me when I was trying to explain the difference between a Kantian theory that could account for relationships across time and space, because it was mature in terms of the history of his writing, that it was the very end of his life when he started saying these sorts of things, especially when he finally came to terms with his emotionally positive reaction to the French Revolution. So it was really that simple. But I think you're right, that it would be really fruitful for me to contemplate the relationship between my labeling this as Kant's mature theory and the concept of maturity in his work. And I really love the idea, sort of Horkheimer and Adorno style, right, of these stages of maturity. It really does make sense. I always find that kind of thinking off-putting, but it's hard to deny its power. That the species taken as a whole, in the light of its technological capacity, does look awfully immature, given the mismatch between technological and ethical capacity. It's a weird kind of old-fashioned thinking, but it's certainly not alien to Kant. You'll notice I eliminated all the historical and teleological stuff from my paper because it's not my favorite. But that doesn't mean it wasn't important to Kant, and maybe I should think harder about why. I love that suggestion. And I wish I had something richer to offer. The fact is, you've just made me aware of this connection, and I'm really grateful. Your questions, I could say more about, and they're fabulous. So on different entities, there's the standard line that you don't have to have Kant to talk about, is that the individualization of risk is part of a coordinated strategy on the part of fossil capital to disempower ethical valuation. So British Petroleum, famously, as demonstrated by Eric Conway and Naomi Oreskes, hired armies of publicists to make us all feel bad about using plastic straws and that kind of thing. And we wouldn't want to participate in that. And it certainly would be a mistake to put the weight of the transition on the shoulder of consumers. Having said that, I think there's a richer story available in Kant, which I didn't illuminate in the paper, where he has almost a reconciliatory story for individuals caught in this imperfect world, and then quite a severe critical story for group agents, especially powerful group agents in the world. So if you compare the treatment of the clergyman and the treatment of the synod, the clergyman isn't expected through any kind of immediate action to bring about a world in which right teaching happens. The clergyman is only expected to fulfill his duties as an individual in an imperfect society, which means obey existing law and try to improve it, but not to act outside the law, and certainly not to be responsible for the. So, if some of the clergyman's flock find themselves lacking in salvation and comfort because of his imperfect sermons that were dictated to him by the center, Kant would not blame the clergyman. Instead, he would say, you really do need to work on improving the system, because the only way to improve ordinary people's lives is through that system. But his criticism of the decision makers, somebody who, for example, treats war like a pleasure party, someone who has the capacity to change the system, is absolutely, almost violently moralistic. He does talk about it as radical evil. He does talk about it as the worst kind of possible wrong, when a decision maker deliberately ignores the freedom of others. So I think you can make a Kantian distinction, just as you suggest, between those two kinds of entities. And one thing I really like about the Kantian treatment of individuals is this sort of like Adorno, or like Rawls, or I should say, sort of full disclosure, like Ben McKean has explained about Adorno and Rawls in a paper in the APSR, which I really liked. There's this function of political philosophy to reconcile people to their imperfect circumstances, so that they don't feel that, given the imperfect world, a good life is impossible. Everyone, for all time, has lived in an imperfect world, and just because we have access to, some self-consciousness about it, doesn't mean we have a particular responsibility to be miserable. So I really like that sort of reconciliation element of Kant when he's talking about individuals, that yes, you are obliged to try to improve the world. No, you are not obliged to take it upon your shoulders. I'd like to write more about this. I haven't, but I think it's there. Um, I'm really grateful that you're pointing me in the direction you already did in December, and you're doing it again, pointing me in the direction of the resources that are already available in Kant, if I think about it without this sort of overlay of official Kantianism. So I will try to find exactly that distinction by thinking originally about his writing and not just putting it into categories, especially the category that I've been most guilty about, which is this teleology, to shove it to a side. Yeah, um, I think I'll leave it there, but wow, thank you.
Fascinating. Thank you so much.
Now, if there are any questions from our audience, you can use the raise hand function to signal that you want to ask a question, or you can just put a question into the chat and I'll read it out. I've got one particular question which kind of struck me towards the end, which is, how do we understand climate budgets with respect to this kind of ethical theory here? Because, of course, climate budgets are a really fascinating thing, because they're a relatively modern phenomena. Up until recently, we didn't know what the climate was constituted by. We certainly didn't have an idea that it is limited in the sense that it turns out to be. So I'm thinking about the pre-Aristotelians, who thought that life just emerged spontaneously from matter. So thus, species extinction could never occur, because, the flies will just also generate from waste eventually, and life will emerge. And then eventually we started going, there are no more dodos about. Why aren't they spontaneously appearing in nature anymore? So we began to realize there are actual physical limits to nature. But that knowledge is relatively modern and incredibly hard to work out. So how do we fit that into a kind of mature cosmopolitanism where people are kind of expected to act under their own aegis when establishing these relationships amongst people?
Oh, that's such a good question. I've been thinking about it a lot. Um, I've been occasionally accused of apocalyptic thinking when I present the budgets. because it does give the impression of the idea of a near approaching end of the world. And of course, that doesn't jibe at all with physical reality. And the apocalypse, such as it is, has been experienced by indigenous people for hundreds of years, and in more limited, it's apocalypse is a thing that happens all the time, right? People's worlds end all the time. Similarly, it's a physical fact that over a very long geological time, the chance of that human beings will extinguish all life is very low. And as long as you don't extend out to, time frames for solar explosions, you could take a long view and say this is just part of flux. I don't take that view. And I think that one really nice thing about the Kantian system is the way it recommends that we set our frame for ethical thinking within a very human capacity. So what matters to us is now and the foreseeable future. And for now and the foreseeable future, the Kantian frame says, yes, freedom is the most important value for interacting humans. And given our physical circumstances, is a lot more difficult than people like Locke imagined, because life doesn't spontaneously recreate itself, because unlike Locke's theory, there isn't terra nullius that the white Westerners can just keep occupying, because there are, in fact, planetary boundaries, because we've reached this new stage of maturity such that there is no nature and everything is either a garden or a dystopia. All of this means that we have a sort of hyper responsibility now for measuring and understanding what are the limits of our rightful activity. And although Kant certainly didn't understand planetary boundaries, he did understand that legitimate freedom meant accounting for the costs of activity on everybody else, something that is really alien to classical liberalism. So with regard to the budgets, as I say, I don't think the budgets represent anything like apocalypticism. What the budgets represent is, imagine if you had everybody in a room together, or maybe even just 100 people representing the Earth. And you said to them, which future do you prefer? Holocene climate stability or Anthropocene instability, more similar to most of the rest of world history? I think most people would prefer climate stability. I think all people would prefer climate stability if they aren't thinking of their short run, minority interests. That fact that it's impossible to imagine people willing for themselves climate instability is what sets formally these budgets. So the people like the IPCC set the budgets according to their climate models. They're not thinking about what people could affirm. But I think just as well, you could set the budgets according to what it is reasonable to expect majorities to affirm in the foreseeable future. So who knows for all time, but we can certainly imagine our children, grandchildren, and their children would prefer stability to instability. And then you go to the scientists and say, well, what amount of emissions gives us a greater than 50% chance of maintaining at least some stability? I mean, the truth is, there's a reasonable possibility that stability for people in more than a few hundred years is just off the table already. But who knows? I don't know. It's certainly not a zero chance that that's already true. But it's also not a zero chance that it's possible with emissions reduction to increase our chances of enjoying the kind of Holocene stability that's allowed us to be so extraordinarily flourishing. So I think you can make a sort of Kantian hypothetical moral case for the reality, for the moral imperative that arises from something that seems as arbitrary as a carbon budget.
Yep. That's a great way. I mean, Shofu, do you have any comment on that as well?
Oh, I don't have comment on that per se, but what you said about reconciling individuals, yeah, in this kind of imperfect situations, and is it related to a sequel of this paper, or is it part of your larger project, or um, yeah,
I think I need to write another paper. My problem is I'm working on a book project which the present day has made almost irrelevant. And I need to figure out what to do with it, wrap it up, and then get back to the stuff that feels more alive to me. So uh, the book project is on how it would be possible for us to coordinate around various planetary boundaries if we respected each other in the way Kant suggests. But it depends on at least the aspirational framework of global institutions, which are no longer really functioning. Um, so I haven't decided what to do with that. But I certainly intend to write a paper apart from this book project, a much more sort of present day interesting paper on the um, reconciliatory implications of Kant's distinction between the clergyman and the synod. I'm I'm really liking that thought. I think it's much more relevant than the book project that it's a let this be a lesson to anybody listening. Do not allow yourself to write slowly, or the world will pass you by.
or when you publish it, you will lay the groundwork to make these institutions work. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll see.
It's or you write so slowly that the problem goes away and then comes back again.
I would love that. If we had even aspirational institutions that we could rely on to orient ourselves. I mean, Paris really fit beautifully in with the Kantian system. It's just that nobody's following it at all anymore. And it's been taken over when it does exist by a tiny coalition of Americans and Saudis who managed to interfere with any possible strong central message.
Oh, because
But
I mean,
apart from that,
I
yeah.
was thinking along those particular lines. I mean, there's something interesting about physical property, and that if for some reason I was able to buy a plot of land, then I can mark out I own the plot of land by putting a fence around it. And when you get a sophisticated society, you don't even need fences. You've got surveyors who go, oh, look, there's a peg in the ground here and a peg in the ground there, and that shows you the border between those things. But it's a kind of physical instantiation oh, of ownership. And then of course, and this is getting into the wonderful world of intellectual property. So your copyrights, your trademarks, your patents. We decided to apply a rule to that. And it seems that that rule set really isn't designed for the everyday person. That's been completely co-opted by powerful vested interests that that trademark law, copyright, and patents isn't for the greater good. It's for a small pool of private individuals. And it seems that we took the wrong lesson from that because that's also how we're now doing climate change regulation. Rather than talking about what do the people think, we go, no, what do the industrial polluters, what would best satisfy them when it
Mhm.
comes to climate change laws? And so there's
Mhm.
something really, really odd about the rule of law here, which I guess is a
Yes.
kind of, which gets in nicely with your discussion here about this mature cosmopolitanism, in that if you are the clergyman in a society where the laws about climate change are orientated towards the private class, and you're still meant to, in some respects, respect the rule of law, then you really do also need that clergyman to be writing op-eds in the paper protesting against those particular states of laws. And of course, the greatest example of that at the moment is the fight between Donald Trump and Pope Leo, where you've got the clergyman in Rome who's writing op-eds about how war isn't a very Christian thing to do versus
Yeah.
the president of the United States who's producing AI produced images of himself as Christ healing the wounded.
Yeah. I do love Kant, but he isn't very good with class analysis, and you cannot understand these dynamics properly without class analysis. Um, and I think that your question really points that out. I mean, you could stretch Kant a lot and say, well, he requires us to imagine a consensus among all affected, and therefore, if it's if it's democratic injustice to the majority interest, then Kant would be against it. But that's really stretching it. I think uh, your sort of standard class analysis is better at getting at this radical disjunction between the Kantian ideal of the rule of law and the actual function of the rule of law in so many areas of our experience, which is to protect the interests of the moneyed against the interest of everybody else. Um, I mean, it would be really blind to look at the history of the rule of law and not see the way that it has consistently served the interests of the most powerful against the interests of the vulnerable. You can make a Kantian critique of that. The thing about that differentiates this sort of Kantian approach to the imperfect world and your more standard critical theoretical approach to this imperfect world is the Kantian approach says, um, being realistic about the function of the rule of law is important so that you know how you can improve it. But until you provide me with an alternative way of coordinating our activities, um, I don't see any alternative. So the Kantian says, yes, critical theorists, you're absolutely right about the function of, let's say, the rule of English law to legitimate land seizure during the genocidal wars against indigenous people, right? There's heaping heaps of literature on that, and it's just a fact. The existence of that fact doesn't give us an alternative to rule of law to coordinate our activities. It's an important critique, but it's not a way forward from a Kantian perspective. So with regard to, yeah.
How would Kant have coped with things like the glorious revolutions of the French Republic, where you might go, well, look, we'll erase the previous state and then re-establish the state on largely the same grounds, but we're kind of erasing the last 45 years of history and doing a kind of clean slate.
Yeah, I mean, there's another sort of real weak point in Kant. If he could have read Tocqueville, it would have been great. But he didn't have any sense that there was a sort of underlying bureaucratic system that transcended the sovereignty of an individual. For him, the killing of a king was a monstrous activity. And because, like I say, he didn't differentiate between the sort of head of state sovereignty and the actual persistent regime. That's just, yeah, it's just something he didn't get. But he was actually, it's really interesting to watch him struggle with the French Revolution because, of course, he's so sympathetic with the professed ideals and so unsympathetic with the disruption in the provision of order. And he eventually comes up with this sort of cheap workaround where he says, we can take it as a sign of enlightened reason that so many people have expressed sympathy with the actions of the revolutionaries. So the only good guys in Kant's view are the Prussian sympathizers, but the actual actors are all sort of consigned to immorality. I do think that's a cheap workaround. It would have been nice to have a just sort of more nuanced political historical view from him, but you can't have everything.
Yeah, and sometimes writing in the moment of revolutionary change, you kind of sometimes you need a bit of distance to be able to understand what you liked versus what you didn't like about a regime change.
Oh, absolutely. The Owl of Minerva.
Well,
It's flying
yeah.
at dusk.
It's the false adage, may you live in interesting times, which is not an ancient Chinese proverb at all. It originates in the UK and then is orientalized to make it seem as if it comes from ancient wisdom from elsewhere, is of course the curse of it's much better to live in non-interesting times because then you can think through a problem.
Yeah. Lately, I've been reading this novel, The Dream of Scipio by Ian Pears, which is not great literature. Pears is a sort of middling figure. I enjoy his work, but he's no, George Eliot. Um, but the reason I've been reading Dream of Scipio is that it's a study of people at the ends of their various civilizations, how they manage as individuals to deal with the collapse of everything that mattered around them. And his characters think hard about that. So he has people at the end of the Roman Empire dealing with the Goth kings, and then he has uh, people at the in the middle of right before the Reformation dealing with the plague, and then he has people in Vichy, France. And each of them is looking at the others, the ones that can look backwards, and all of them are struggling um, with the impossibility of their existing circumstances and finding solace in the past. Oh,
Mm,
it's quite a
yeah.
good novel.
Wow, it's
Is it?
fictional? Is it fictionalized or it's more based on, yeah, historical moments of these actually lived experience? Yeah.
So he's a great historical novelist in that you can rely on him to have done his homework and to have a sort of a nuanced understanding of what people were thinking about at the time. So he has another book called Instance of a Finger Post,
Mm.
which is
That's
about
the
when
one
he
I've
was
read.
a
Yeah.
doctor. Yeah, so that one he did actually use correspondence. In this case, the characters are all fictional, but they could have existed in these times. Like, for example, he has a really his figure at the end of the Roman Empire was one of these uh, Roman nobles who got a lot of territory in Gaul when times were better and was watching his serfs run away and, just failing to manage. And he made a calculated decision to convert to Christianity and become the local bishop, basically in order to try to protect his land. That seems super truthy to me as a non-professional historian. So
Wow.
mm, it's, I think, like I say, I do think it's important for us to try to find comfort in thinking about how, as on the one hand, our circumstances are unprecedented because there is something new under the sun, and it is this Anthropocene time, and it is uh, something extremely new that we are able to hold the fate of human and non-human life now and in the future in our collective hands. On the other hand, the sort of ethical structure isn't new at all, and people have always struggled with this, and maybe even non-humans for all I know. And I find that super comforting. I don't know if
Yes.
you guys saw the news about a documented chimpanzee civil war.
Oh,
It was in the
yes.
New York
Yeah.
Times this week. They said
Yeah.
like we've seen wars against other groups, but we've never seen a civil war before. And yeah, it makes you think.
Yes. I mean, it certainly does make you think we're not as distant from our close cousins on the hominid chain as maybe we sometimes like to think.
Yep, yep.
Now, are there any other questions? Or is there any other comments you want to make, chauffeur, based upon the conversation we've just had?
Well, should we make sure we have time for the audience to raise some
Well, yeah,
questions?
that's it. Yeah, so
Yeah.
this is giving them time if indeed they want to ask questions. Q and A's can sometimes be quite quiet here in the Middle Kingdom.
Ah, I see.
Yeah.
I'm happy to talk to anybody over email, um, anybody who has further
Yeah.
questions.
Do you want to share your email in
Yeah,
the chat just in case?
sure.
Because yes, Lisa is quite happy to take emailed questions if you're not happy to ask questions at this particular time. There we go. So yes, Lisa Ellis at otago.ac.nz, and there is a period between Lisa and Ellis. Okay, well, I'm going to assume then that we don't have any questions from the audience here, but people do have the ability to send questions on to Lisa if they so desire. Any final comments from our speaker or our respondent?
Yeah, just want to say thank you for organizing that and for this fascinating paper. Yeah, does ignites my interest in reading more Kant. It's such a compelling talk and paper.
Yeah, I also want to echo your thanks. I'm really encouraged to write this second paper now and to go back and rethink a lot of my choices. I'm so grateful for both of you, these deep and interesting questions. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk about the work in progress. Um, Now is the time when I can actually make it better. So thank you.
Yeah, and thank you both. Every time I hear lectures on Kant's political philosophy, I become more and more aware that when I was taught Kant during my MA, either I didn't really appreciate his thinking, or maybe the teaching wasn't particularly effective. Because I find more and more to like about Kant on political philosophy, the more I hear it kind of explicates, especially just how deep his thoughts were about the orientation and creation of the state, because it seems he bites a lot of bullets, as we'd say in modern parlance, to go, well, look, these things start badly, but that doesn't mean that they're cursed from birth. Good things can come out of them as long as good people are actually active in those systems. So yes, the more I hear about Kant, the more I go, maybe I am a more Kantian philosopher than I thought I was. So thank you both, Lisa and Shofu, for helping me show the light towards Kantian philosophy.
Thanks.
Okay, so with that, I will bring today's session to a close. I'll send the recording on to both of you once it's uploaded to YouTube. So if you want to then make that public for the rest of the world to see, that can be arranged. Otherwise, hopefully I'll be talking to all of you again sometime soon.
Thanks, everyone. Such a pleasure.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, I shall